We can go on the record. The time is 6:01 p.m. This is the hearing for Deschutes County file number 2472302-DR, which is a request by the Oregon Department of Transportation for a declaratory ruling. My name is Tommy Brooks. I'm the hearings officer in this matter. And before we turn to the particulars of the hearing tonight, I'm going to turn things over to Ms. House to describe how the electronic and in-person participation process works.
All right, good evening. For the record, my name is Caroline House, and I'm a senior planner with the Deschutes County Planning Division. Let's get my slide to advance, sorry. So I'll start tonight by explaining how the hearing will be conducted. Then I'll provide a brief staff report. Then we'll move on to the testimony portion of the hearing. So the first person to testify will be the applicant. They'll be afforded 30 minutes. Then persons in support will have 3 minutes. Then persons in opposition will have 3 minutes as well. And anyone neutral can also testify, but that will be last, and they'll be given three minutes as well. After that, the applicant will have 10 minutes to provide rebuttal testimony. And then at the end, staff can provide closing comments, if any. And I do want to note the hearings officer can eliminate or modify these time limits as he sees fit. So for tonight's hearing, it's a hybrid hearing, so both in-person and remote participation is allowed. Regardless of how you're testifying tonight, before you start your testimony, please provide your first and last name as well as your mailing address. If you're attending in person, hearings officer Brooks or myself will call you up to provide your testimony. Please come up to one of the desks here at the front and make sure to speak into the microphone. That ensures the hearings officer who's attending remotely and anyone else watching remotely can hear what you're saying. And if you can also write your contact information on the sign-in sheet, if you haven't already signed in, that would be appreciated. For our remote participants, you must be attending using Zoom in order to testify tonight. Hearings officer Brooks will request that you use the raise hand feature to notify him that you would like to testify. If you're on a computer or smart device, you'll see a raise hand button in the bottom center portion of your screen. You'll need to click that. And if you've called in, you'll need to dial *9 on your keypad to raise your hand. In addition to oral testimony tonight, anybody can submit written testimony as well. If you're in person, please hand that to me. If you're attending remotely, you'll need to email that to me. My email's on the screen, but it's caroline.house@deschutes.org. Hearings officer Brooks and staff are responsible for a respectful and orderly hearing. Anyone being disruptive may be asked to leave. And with that, I'm going to ask if there are any objections to the hearing format that was just described. If you're attending remotely, you'll need to use the raise hand feature. So I'm not seeing any raised hands, so I'll turn the hearing back over to hearings officer Brooks.
Hey, thank you, Ms. House. As just described, we are following the normal hearing procedures that are set forth in the county's code, and I will make sure to provide sufficient opportunity for everyone to participate at the right time. This application is being considered through a quasi-judicial process. As such, I will consider only the factual evidence that is in the record. I will then apply those facts to any relevant provisions of the county's comprehensive plan and land use regulations. The standards and applicable criteria relevant to this hearing were identified in the public notice that announced the hearing. They're also set forth in the staff report. The public notice and the staff report are posted on the county's website, and they're also available directly from staff upon request. It is important that you direct all of your testimony to the standards and applicable criteria. If you believe a criterion applies that was not listed, you may address the unlisted criterion, but I urge you to also explain why the criterion applies and to do so with specificity so that other participants may respond and so that I can address that issue in my decision. The failure to raise an issue with enough detail that enables me or other participants to respond precludes your ability to appeal that issue to the Land Use Board of Appeals. Also, the failure to raise a constitutional or other issue relating to any proposed conditions of approval, again with enough detail that allows me to respond to that issue in my decision, precludes an action for damages in circuit court. As I noted, I serve as the county's hearings officer in this matter, and in that role, my job is to be a neutral decision maker. Thus, while I have a contract with the county to serve in this role, I am obligated to remain impartial, and I do not represent the county's interests or the interests of any participant. I'll state for the record that I do not have any relationship with the applicant, and I am not aware of any connections I may have to other participants in this proceeding that would prevent me from remaining impartial. I have communicated with staff briefly, but only to discuss the particulars of today's hearing and not the substance of the application. I do not have any ex parte contacts to disclose. I would like to see what the sign-up sheet looks like so I can figure out how the timing of tonight's hearing is going to work. So Ms. House, are you able to determine the number of people that have signed up for tonight's hearing?
So right now we have 4 participants attending remotely. And then can I get a raise of hands, non-applicant participants tonight? 1. Randy, are you going to be testifying?
He's going to ask if I can have some.
Okay.
Just brief comments, but I'm going to be in opposition, so can I give Chris my time?
Maybe let's have you come up to the microphone and explain what you're requesting so the hearings officer can hear your request.
Randy Winlinks here. So how does the time break down? I would maybe like to make a few comments, but I'd prefer to give my time to Chris if that's possible.
It sounds like I'm going to let both of you speak if you want to. And it doesn't sound like there's that many people signed up for tonight. So I'll probably be inclined to let you provide some of your time to another participant if you'd like to, but we can address that at that stage.
Alrighty. Thank you, Tommy. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So it looks like no more than 6 people would be testifying tonight that are not the applicant.
Okay. Thank you. So with that, does anyone wish to challenge my ability to hear this matter or to challenge the county's jurisdiction over the matter? And again, I guess if you're online, you can hit the raise hand button or signal Ms. House in the hearing room.
All right. So there's no raised hands online and no one in the hearings room has any objections.
Okay. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Ms. House, to deliver the staff report.
Great. So for my staff report tonight, I just have a few slides, but just beginning with the location. So the subject properties are the ODOT Highway 97 right-of-way, and as well as the High Desert Museum. What you can see here on the screen is the applicant's illustration for the proposed trail. The northern terminus starts at the Baker Road, Highway 97 intersection, and travels all the way south to the Lava Lands Visitor Center. And I do want to note that the county's review authority does not extend onto federal land. So the staff report, for example, did not address that segment of the trail. So the applicant has requested interpretations of the county zoning code, zoning maps, and comprehensive plan to determine if the proposed multi-use path is a use permitted outright. And based on the submitted materials, the multi-use path will be open to both bicyclists and pedestrians. In the staff report, I've identified 5 key questions or issues that the county is asking the hearings officer to consider as part of his review. The first is, do the requirements of Title 17 apply to the proposal? Secondly, what is the proposed use? Third, what zoning designation or designations apply to this segment of the Highway 97 right-of-way? And then based on that, is the proposed use permitted outright, conditionally, or is it not allowed? And lastly, staff asked the hearings officer to determine if a goal for exception is needed. I do want to note that public comments have been received. After the staff report was published, 6 comments in support were received. Additionally, the county's received comments in opposition, mainly from property owners abutting or adjacent to the subject proposal. And all of these materials are published on the website, as well as the application materials, staff report, everything that's in the record is available here. And I did want to note, there was one additional comment from the Community Development Department's GIS systems analyst that was added just this week, and it's dated 11/20. It was not incorporated into my staff report, but it is in the record. And the county is asking the hearings officer to consider that information as part of his review. And that concludes what I have prepared for my staff report, but I am available for questions from hearings officer Brooks.
Okay. Ms. House, will you let me know who the name of the individual that you just mentioned would have submitted the comments on from the GIS standpoint? I just want to make sure I've got that one in the record.
It is Tim Berg.
Thank you. I do not have any other questions for staff at the moment, so we will go ahead and call up the applicant.
Good evening, for the record, David Anderson.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It sounds like someone is talking, but it's very faint at the moment.
Can you hear me okay now?
There you go. Thank you.
All right. For the record, David Amaton, Oregon Department of Transportation.
Ken Schunkweiler, Oregon Department of Transportation.
And good evening, hearing officer Brooks. My name is Stacy Postgate. I'm with the Department of Justice.
All right. Good evening, Officer Brooks. As I stated, for the record, my name is David Amaton. I'm the Planning and Programming Manager for ODOT Region 4. I'm joined this evening by Ken Schunkweiler, who's our Region Principal Planner, as well as Stacy Postgate, who's online, and she's our counsel from the Department of Justice. And we're here this evening to share our declaratory ruling response for the proposed Lava Butte path with you. To preface our discussion, we're constructing a 6-mile biking and walking path between Bend and Lava Butte within the existing US 97 transportation corridor and almost exclusively within existing US 97 right-of-way. The path will connect Bend, Sun River, and Deschutes County residents with popular destinations in the area, including Lava Lands Visitor Center, Lava Butte, High Desert Museum, and Benham Falls. In our presentation, we'll demonstrate that this path is a Class 3 road and street project under Deschutes County Code 1804030 because it's a transportation improvement that does not have significant land use implication. We'll demonstrate that the path alignment on the east side of 97 passes through land zoned rural residential 10 and open space and conservation via minor easements on High Desert Museum property, and that in those lands, the path is an outright permitted use as a Class 3 project. There is some dispute that 2,400 feet of the total 6-mile path is zoned Forest Use 2. And in our presentation, we'll demonstrate through reference to Deschutes County Code 1812040 that the original zoning map controls the zoning boundary between ODOT's right-of-way and adjacent lands to the east, and that the original zoning map clearly shows that ODOT's right-of-way is zoned entirely rural residential 10, not Forest Use 2. We'll refer to Deschutes County staff's expert opinion in the record to support our position regarding the correct zoning boundary, and we'll further reference past WUBA decision to reinforce that Deschutes County Code requires that the original zoning map, not past board opinion, controls the zoning. In conclusion, we'll ask that the hearings officer agree with ODOT that our right-of-way is zoned RR10, not Forest Use 2, that the path is an outright permitted use in the RR10 and open space conservation zones as a Class 3 project. In the alternative, and if the hearings officer determines that our right-of-way, that a portion of ODOT's right-of-way is zoned F2, we'll ask that the hearings officer determine that the path is an outright permitted use through the F2 zone, And finally, if the hearings officer determines that a portion of ODOT's right-of-way is zoned F2 and the path is not an outright permitted use in that zone, we'll ask that the hearings officer determine that the path may be permitted as a conditional use with no goal exception required. In the remaining slides, we'll cover the following areas. We'll review the project scope, classification, and plan consistency. We'll discuss zoning boundaries, zone consistency, and disputed zoning, and we'll close with a brief project summary. As I mentioned, the Lava Butte Path is a 6-mile biking and walking facility that connects Bend to Lava Butte. At the north end, the path begins on the east side of US 97 at Knott Road and follows US 97 south to the High Desert Museum, where it crosses under the highway to the west side of 97 and continues south to Lava Butte on federal lands. Except for minor easements on High Desert Museum property and southern sections of the path on US Forest Service property, the path is entirely within existing ODOT right-of-way. The path improves north-south travel for people walking and biking along US 97. These activities are currently allowed, permitted, and utilized on US 97 shoulders. However, the path will provide a much safer and comfortable facility than the existing shoulders, which can contain rumble strips, debris, and place people walking and biking directly adjacent to 65-mile-an-hour posted speed cars, trucks, and freight. The path's northern access is Knott Road, which is a designated county bikeway. And the future Arnold Canal Trail is planned to terminate at Knott Road in US 97 and will provide a continuous connection between the proposed Lava Butte Path and rapidly growing neighborhoods in Southeast Bend. No parking is currently proposed at the path's northern terminus. In the middle of the path corridor, access is provided at High Desert Museum, where a portion of the museum's parking will be available for those accessing the Lava Butte Path. The path's southern access is Lava Lands Visitor Center, where additional parking will be available for those accessing the Lava Butte Path. The existing paved Sun Lava Path terminates at the Lava Lands Visitor Center and will provide continuous connections between the proposed Lava Butte Path, Benham Falls, and Sun River to the west. Here's a conceptual plan view of the path. North is to the left. In this graphic, you can see ODOT's preferred east side alignment shown in blue, as well as 2 alternate west side alignments shown in red. As you can see, the preferred east side alignment has 0 direct impacts to private properties and minimizes ground disturbance and major earthwork, grubbing, and tree removal. The ODOT team incorporated these goals into the alignment development process. Placing the path on the east side of the highway also avoids direct proximity to the active Burlington Northern and Santa Fe rail line on the west side of the highway, as well as the heavy traffic and turn movements that occur at the southbound interchange ramp terminal and at the access that serves the Riverwoods Country Store and Morningstar Christian School. If the northern section of the path were to be located on the west side of 97, at a minimum, all 4 private properties near the path's northern terminus would require right-of-way acquisition, and the path's alignment, sandwiched between the railroad and US 97, would be constrained. This slide depicts the path's right-of-way impacts on the east side of the highway on High Desert Museum property. As I mentioned, at this location, minor amounts of right-of-way will be acquired as easements shown in purple to support the highway undercrossing and to connect to the museum parking. The museum has been supportive of the project, is here this evening virtually in support of the project, and a support letter was included with ODOT's response to the county's incomplete letter. The zoning for the easements on High Desert Museum property is open space conservation, where Class 3 projects are permitted as an outright use. As I mentioned earlier, the path is considered a Class 3 project under Deschutes County Code 1804030. It's a traffic safety improvement to the existing US 97 transportation corridor that does not have significant land use implications. The path is a necessary safety improvement that addresses known risk factors to people biking and walking along US 97 shoulders, including high speeds and volumes, rumble strips, and a mix of heavy vehicles that can make it challenging and unsafe to travel along the corridor on foot and by bike. This section of US 97 has a documented crash history, including nearly 100 crashes in the most recent 5-year crash history. The Lava Butte path responds to those risk factors and that crash history by providing a safe facility for people to bike and walk within the existing US 97 transportation corridor. As a Class 3 project, the path utilizes only minor amounts of right-of-way in the form of easements on High Desert Museum property, and the path alignment was intentionally developed to minimize impacts to private property and earthwork. Furthermore, the path does not have significant land use implications. People already choose to bike and walk within the US 97 transportation corridor with some frequency. The Lava Butte path simply improves and provides a safer facility for those activities to occur within the US 97 right-of-way. For these reasons, the Lava Butte path is a Class 3 project. Conversely, the path does not meet any of the defining criteria of a Class 1 or a Class 2 project, since it's not a major project such as a new controlled access freeway, nor is it the construction of a road or street project of 4 or more lanes on a new location. Finally, the project involves only minor amounts of right-of-way, results in no new travel patterns, and is not a new county road or street, public right-of-way where none existed before. I'll now hand over the remainder of the presentation to Ken Schonkweiler and gladly answer questions along the way or at the end.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Deschutes County and Hearings Officer Brooks. So as we see in this slide, we will begin to discuss how the project is consistent with the Deschutes County planning documents and Deschutes County code. So looking at this map from Deschutes County's website, US 97 is listed as a county bikeway from the Deschutes County bikeway map. US 97 is also an identified bikeway in Deschutes County in the Deschutes County 2012 TSP. In this document, the Deschutes County 2012 TSP references principal arterials and alternate routes on page 97. Typically, main bike routes are chosen because they are the most direct, desirable routes. These routes often utilize the shoulders of state highways. The volumes and speeds of traffic, as well as the mix of heavy vehicles, can make it challenging to ride along the shoulders of highways. Additionally, for valid safety reasons, ODOT often scours the shoulders to make rumble strips as a countermeasure to inattentive drivers leaving the roadway. These can be harsh on bicycle wheels. From the Deschutes County 2012 TSP, Table 2.2.T14 lists alternate routes to use for county bikeways that may be less desirable in the current configuration. US 97 is specifically listed from Sun River to Bend with Forest Road number 41. The Deschutes County TSP in 2012 states that alternate routes were identified in the plan to enhance and supplement rather than supersede the main routes. Alternate routes are usually the most cost-effective or immediate way to provide for bicycle movement through a difficult section. As such, they may serve in a primary capacity until the main route can be improved for bicycle traffic. This statement makes it clear that the intent of the 2012 TSP is for the bikeway and the proposed development area on US 97 to be improved in the future. The 2012 TSP and Deschutes County Code Section 1748-140A2 requires collectors and arterials shown in the county transportation plan map to be constructed to include bikeways as defined by the Deschutes County Master Plan. US 97 in the proposed development area is identified as a principal arterial on the county transportation plan map. With respect to the appropriate bike facility type for the designated US 97 bikeway, Deschutes County Code 1748-140B1 further requires multi-use paths shall be used where aesthetic, recreation, and safety concerns are primary, and a direct route with few intersections can be established. So as David previously discussed, this project is a Class 3 project consistent with Deschutes County Code 1748 and the Deschutes County TSP from 2012. It is identified as a bikeway and further identified as a route where future improvements are expected. Code also clearly indicates that the appropriate facility is a separated pathway, which directly reflects the Lava Butte project scope. Transitioning on to discuss zoning boundaries for the project. now that we have established that the project is a Class 3 project under Deschutes County Code 18 and is consistent with the 2012 TSP, let's discuss the zoning for the project boundary. Starting with the Dial GIS map, we can orient ourselves with the property boundaries and zoning for US 97 and ODOT right-of-way. To the east of the center line, ODOT right-of-way is 155 feet to the property line, indicated by the small gap between the zoning boundary and the center line on the east side. We recognize that Dial is not the official zoning map, but it is a replica of the official Mylars. The same gap in the Dial GIS zoning map is shown in the original Mylars, the map control in Deschutes County Code. Highway center line, thinner in nature, running north and south in this red circled area on the graphic above, differentiates between the thicker zoning boundary lines that are exhibited on the map. There is a clear gap between the F2 zoning, open space and conservation zone, and the RR10 zoning that covers the rest of the highway. Both zoning maps show the ODOT right-of-way as rural residential 10, and then open space and conservation when the project enters the High Desert Museum property. All ODOT owned property in the project area is zoned rural residential 10, RR10. In our response, we referenced Deschutes County Code and a historical LUBRA case that determined the zoning boundaries and the map control for the project. So Deschutes County Code 181240, the code states that in case of any dispute regarding the zoning classification of the property subject to the county code, the original ordinance with the map exhibit contained in the official county records will control. We, ODOT, maintain that there is no uncertainty with regards to the zoning for ODOT right-of-way on the east side of the highway center line, and that the original ordinance and map exhibit contained in county records show a clear boundary line between ODOT right-of-way, owned outright in fee, and the subsequent adjacent parcel 2 of partition plot 90-19642. Comments from Deschutes County staff Peter Russell referring to conditional use 9043-V 98.6 imply that the Board of County Commission decision that was referenced earlier in our presentation may establish the zoning boundaries for the proposed project within Highway 97. We'd like to point out in our presentation that historical Board of County Commission decisions are not supported by a county code, nor are they listed as a rule or criteria for establishing zoning boundaries. We maintain that there is not confusion of the zoning boundaries, and therefore sections 1 through 3 of 181240 do not apply. The map control is the clear boundary in the original Deschutes County Mylars. The historical Board of County Commission case did not officially change the zoning for the ODOT parcel in question. It was an opinion of the Board of County Commissions at that time. LUBA case law, Housing Authority of Jackson County versus Medford 65, LUBA 295 reinforces this point. In the case, the city denied the applicant, arguing that the zoning is erroneous or in need of additional analysis due to the previous city council decisions regarding the zoning of the parcel. LUBA disagreed and referenced the city back to the original map controls, which ultimately determined that incomplete recording of the zoning for the parcel in question had occurred. The comprehensive plan had not been officially changed for the zoning or the parcel in question. The resulting case law was that the zoning designation of the property that is shown on the official zoning map is the valid zoning designation for the property. Interpretation based on prior Board of County Commission decisions or claims of unclear zoning map boundaries would be contrary to existing LUBA case law and Deschutes County Code 181240. In sum, ODOT maintains that the original Mylars are clear and that uncertainty does not exist for ODOT right-of-way in this location. The property in question is zoned RR10. As a recap, the original Mylars are clear and certain that ODOT's right-of-way is zoned RR10, and the eastern right-of-way boundary and property line that separates ODOT's RR10 zoning from the adjacent F2 zoning of the properties to the east. This is also clearly shown on Dial, the county's official digital replica of the original Mylars. The fact that the original replica reflects the original Mylars and shows the gap between the eastern right-of-way boundary and the US 97 center line is not accidental. And here we would like to reference county agency comments submitted into the record by Tim Berg, Deschutes County's longtime geographic information systems expert in the areas of zoning, land use, and permit data. Mr. Berg comments in the records include the following. From a historical perspective, the Mylar maps have always been somewhat cumbersome to interpret and were maintained by staff who were not specifically trained in cartographic principles. Decisions were made in the past 20 years that were also made by decision makers that did not have a very effective tool set. Oftentimes, those decision makers did not have computers or programs that allowed them to zoom, pan, scale, or make interpretations from images or maps that we can likely more easily do today. It is my belief that the zoning boundary that extends along the eastern edge of Highway 97 south of Bend is accurately depicted based on measurements that I have compared from the original Mylar zoning maps. In summary, the county's original Mylars, the county's official digital replica, and the county's own internal technical expert agreed that ODOT's right-of-way is zoned entirely RR10. No uncertainty exists as to the zoning boundary. So next, we would like to pivot on the zone consistency for both the open space and conservation zone, where our high desert museum easements are being obtained, in our rural residential zoning for the ODOT parcel east of the US 97 center line. The proposed path meets the definition of a Class 3 project for the entirety of the project in both zones under Deschutes County Code 1848-20, Open Space Conservation, and 1860-20, Rural Residential 10. Since it is a Class 3 project, the proposed path is an outright permitted use for both zones in Section 1848 and 1860, and no land use permits would be required. In our response, ODOT acknowledges that site plan review may be required per 18-124-30, and we have included support from the High Desert Museum in our application. So we were asked in our application to discuss the F2 resource zoning issue, and our discussion is on the slide above. So first, we would again like to point out that we maintain that the proposed project is not within F2 resource zoning and is instead within rural residential 10 zoning. If the hearings officer finds the parcel in question to be zoned F2, we would like to point out that the project is a modification of US 97 and ODOT right-of-way, and Deschutes County Code 1840-02, Section J lists outright permitted uses, including the widening of existing roads within existing right-of-way, provided the project is consistent with the TSP and ORS 215-283-1. Plan consistency was discussed in slides 8 through 9. ORS 215-283-1I lists permitted uses in exclusive farm zones and non-marginal lands, explicitly stating that the following applicable criteria. Section I, reconstruction or modification of public roads, highways, including the placement of utility overhead and subsurface of public roads and highways along public right-of-way, but not including the addition of travel lanes where no removal or displacement of buildings would occur or no new land parcels would result. The proposed path fits under this criteria, as the path would be part of US 97 right-of-way, making it a modification of US 97. If the hearings officer finds the project and the parcel in question to be zoned F2 and not outright permitted, we would ask the hearings officer to reference Deschutes County Code 1840-030, which lists conditional uses, including public road and highway projects as described in ORS 215-283-2 and 215-283-3. So ORS 215-283-3B references the standards for approval for certain uses in exclusive farm zones. For those uses identified by rule of the Land Conservation and Development Commission as provided in Section 3, Chapter 529, Oregon Law 1993. We would then reference OAR 660-012-0065, Section 1, the Transportation Planning Rule, Goal 12, of statewide planning goals, which identifies transportation improvements which may be permitted on rural lands consistent with goals 3, 4, and 14 without a goal exception. Further listing these in Section 8, there are bikeways, footpaths, recreational trails not otherwise allowed as a modification or part of an existing road. It's here where we would point out that Lava Butte Path is a north-south transportation facility, part of US 97 in ODOT right-of-way, and where we would point out that no goal exception would be needed in the event that the hearings officer would find that the F2 zoning, resource zoning applies, a conditional use permit would apply, and that no goal exception would be required. To wrap up our Lava Butte Path declaratory ruling, there are a number of key points that we would like to make. So starting from the top, the project is a north-south parallel transportation facility that accommodates existing users on US 97. It is a Class 3 project as identified in Deschutes County Code. It is supported by the goals and policies in the TSP and Deschutes County Code. The property in question is zoned RR10 and open space and conservation, where the project enters High Desert Museum property. And in both of these zones, the project would be an outright permitted use with no land use permits required. And our forest zone summary, again, we maintain that the 2,400 feet in question is not zoned F2. If it is zoned F2, we would ask the hearings officer to find that it is an outright permitted use. And if the hearings officer finds that it is zone 2 and not an outright permitted use, we would reference both, or we would ask the hearings officer to find that there is not a goal exception required. Thank you. I would ask David Amonton if he has any additional comments or questions.
No, I think we've shared the information that we wanted to bring this evening, and we're prepared to answer questions.
All right, thank you. I do have a few questions for you. I'll try to lump them in categories. Just, I guess, first on the zoning issue and what the actual zoning of the right of way is. Part of your application indicates that originally, maybe back in the at least by 1979, that the rural residential zone was on both sides of the right of way, and that the properties that are adjacent now to the east were rezoned to the F2. Is that anything you have the history on, or have explored? Or I guess, are the original Mylars that you're referring to, I guess, part of that decision to rezone those properties?
I'm not aware of any rezoning of properties to the east ODOT's right of way.
Okay, it's on the second page of your burden of proof. It says that the private property abutting the east side of the US 97 right of way was subsequently rezoned to forest use. And just before that, it says that the 1979 Deschutes County zoning map clearly shows ODOT right of way on both the east and west sides of the US 97 being zoned RR10. So I took from that the entire area was at one point RR10, and then that it was subsequently rezoned to the F2. Is it? But if that's not what you were trying to say, that's fine.
I don't believe that's the case. There was information in the excuse me, the FEIS of the previously referenced way station case from 20 years ago that identified a property. The FEIS identified one of the properties to the east of ODOT right away as rural residential 10 that is currently forest use 2. And I think the implication or the interpretation was that a zone change had occurred, but I can't find any information in the record to support that. I think that that the Mylars show that it's forest use too, and I'm not aware of any future or any zone change that has occurred since.
Okay, and then just to confirm, the original original Mylars that you're relying on, what are the dates of those? Is that reflected in the record?
It is in the record. Offhand, I believe it's 1979,
Okay.
but it's in the record.
Okay. The other question is, I guess, sort of related to that. I'm just trying to piece together the time frame here potentially. As you mentioned, a 1990 decision where the eastern properties were partitioned. Is that decision in the record at all? I mean, it seems to me that might be some indication of where the zone boundaries were at the time.
I don't believe that decision is in the record.
Okay.
Actually, excuse me, Officer Brooks. I think it is in the record. It's attached to the staff report.
Okay, I will keep looking. I've not seen, this is and to be clear, I'm not asking, there was reference to a number of past decisions. One was an ODOT application for the way station that was denied, but there's a reference to another process of the partitioning process of some adjacent property. Again, and that's referenced in the burden of proof as a 1990 decision. It's got a partition plat number 90-19642. I don't know if I've seen that, but if it's there, I will find it. If it's not, it's not.
Officer Brooks,
Yes.
if I could, so the zoning map that we referenced in our presentation and in our application is dated November 1st, 1979.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just one question about, I guess I'm at one of your alternative arguments. And if the property were zoned F2 and then your reliance on RS 215, 283-1, the written materials, or I guess what the statute says is it excludes if there's an additional travel lane. Your written materials say this is not an additional travel lane. Could you kind of walk through that a little bit? I guess, why isn't the entire path an additional lane that's accommodating travel?
I think if I understand the question, Officer Brooks, I believe that would be because as you would commonly understand or interpret a path, that's not the same thing as a travel lane. A general purpose travel lane has a distinct definition in the transportation industry.
Officer Brooks, in the highway design manual from ODOT, a travel lane is defined as a travel lane that would accommodate vehicle traffic. And we would differentiate that between one that accommodates bikes and pedestrians or people walking and rolling, where vehicles would not be prohibited to travel.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I think you guys answered a lot of the questions I had actually anticipated coming into this. I appreciate your thorough presentation. I don't think I have additional questions for you at the moment. I may during rebuttal, and of course you'll have a chance to come back up for rebuttal, so we can conclude the applicant's presentation right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will, this will be the time for anyone who signed up to give testimony that is in support of the application.
Is there anyone in person to testify in support? And if you're attending remotely, can you use the raised hand feature now to notify us that you'd like to testify in support? And we're elevating someone right now, Hearings Officer Brooks.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, can you hear us okay?
We can hear you.
Great. Good evening, Officer Brooks. My name is Dana Whitelaw. I'm the Executive Director at the High Desert Museum, and I'm joined by Josh Newton, a member of the Board of Trustees. The High Desert Museum is a nationally recognized arts, science, and humanities institution. On behalf of the museum, I'm providing comments in support of the multi-use path proposed by the Oregon Department of Transportation, which when complete will provide museum visitors from Bend and Sun River an exciting, accessible, and more sustainable way to visit the museum. Through the museum's exploration of the high desert, we seek to cultivate a world where people and the landscape thrive together. We also aim to wildly excite and responsibly teach through innovative interdisciplinary experiences that create connection to and dialogue about our region, the high desert. We have been inspiring our audience and our community since 1982 and are consistently rated as the top Central Oregon attraction by TripAdvisor. With 135 acres and more than 100,000 square feet of exhibition space in the museum, it is truly a must-see for anyone traveling through or residing in the region. The museum is located south of Bend on Highway 97, and for several years, we've been working with ODOT on a path alignment that would allow people to use the path to visit the museum. Current discussions envision the path being located in part on museum property. And while ODOT and the museum still have much to do in order to allow the path to be located on museum property, including an agreement on the path design and final approval from the museum's Board of Trustees, the museum supports ODOT's request for an interpretation of the county's zoning code, zoning maps, and comprehensive plan to determine that the location of the path within ODOT's right-of-way and lands owned by the High Desert Museum is a permitted outright by those authorities. Thank you so much for hearing us this evening.
Thank you. Ms. House,
And
does
Hearings
anyone
Officer
else
Brooks,
raise their
there are
hand?
no other raised hands.
Okay, then we can proceed with anyone who has signed up to give testimony in opposition to the application.
Good evening, Mr. Brooks. Chris Koback on behalf of Windlinks Ranch Trust. I'm going to use 5 of the 6 minutes if it's okay with you and leave just 1 minute for my client, Mr. Windlinks. Is that acceptable?
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you. And with 5 minutes, I'm going to hit the high points as best I can. And I've given Ms. House detailed written testimony and I'll leave a copy for ODOT as well. So we think this has kind of been overcomplicated. There's really some key issues that the hearings officer has to decide. And the first one is, there's 3 zones involved here, the potential zones. There's the RR10, the open space, and then the F2. And the first issue is really to define what zones are there, because as you know, you first find out what the zone is, and then you go to the code, and the code usually tells you what you can and cannot do within those zones, and the uses vary from zone to zone. So the first issue is, well, what is all the property? Well, we believe the issue of the majority of the path, about 50% of the path, is on F2 property. And there has been a formal decision on that, a formal determination by the governing body of Deschutes County in 1998 on the very same property that it's F2. Now, you heard about Mylars, you heard about all this. What you didn't hear about is there's important law that we have to follow. And I've given it to you in my written stuff. Ganson versus Lane County is one of the more recent cases on it. And that is, you cannot collaterally attack a prior final land use decision, even if it's wrong. Luba has said that over and over again. Ganson is one, and then that Safeway and North Bend case is another one where the decision was wrong, a first decision. And in Ganson, it's real important. There was a 2002 determination that a lot was verified as a lot of record. In 2020, when the owner went back to do some other land use stuff, the hearings officer said, no, I don't think it's a lot of record. That decision was wrong. And that's where Luba said, you can't do that. So what we have here is in 1998, the county board, governing body, considering an application by the same applicant on the same property, determined that the official zoning map depicted this property was as F2. That's a final land use decision. It cannot be collaterally attacked. The ODOT has forgot to that part of the analysis. So even if that decision is wrong, the hearings officer cannot go back in a subsequent proceeding and reverse the county board's determination. So now that we have that established, we know that there are 3 zones. And what we have to do is look at what is the use, because that's important. You know, you go to the code and then we got to find out what uses are allowed in those zones. So if you look at the 3 zones in F2, it lists all the uses. This is not a highway project. We've given you what ODOT and its partner, the U.S. Forest Service, have said for many years consistently what this is. On the FLAP application where they get their money, and the first 3 pages, at least 9 times I've highlighted it, they said this is a multi-use path. And that's important because in the county code, a multi-use path is defined as a distinct separate use. If you look at the uses under these various zones, they list road and street projects as a use allowed in certain zones. Now, that's a distinct use that's defined, road project, and there's class 1, 2, 3. I agree with that. Multi-use path is a separately defined use. And importantly, it is allowed in a zone. The commissioners decided it was allowed in the Lapine zone. That's the only zone that use is allowed in. And I've given you some case law on that, and you're probably aware of it. But, you know, when you're interpreting these ordinances, you interpret them like statutes. And the statutory construction cases tell you that when the drafters of legislation use a term in one area and they omit it in another area, you're to presume that's intentional. So here, as it applies to zoning, and this comes up a lot with similar use determinations, you can only get a similar use determination if the use is not listed in another zone. And that's kind of a corollary to this whole legal doctrine. When a use is listed in one zone and not in another, you're supposed to assume that was an intentional omission and it's not permitted in that zone. And so because this is a specifically defined use in one zone, you have to conclude that the drafters of the code intended it not to be allowed in any zone that it's not listed. And so if you look at the F2 zone, multi-use path is not allowed either outright or conditionally. If you look at the RR10 zone, 18.60, it's not listed as an allowed use either outright or conditional. If you look in the open space zone, 18.848, it's not listed as either. So to avoid that, to try to avoid that, well, actually that ends the inquiry right there, I think, because you have a specifically defined use. It can't be a multi-use path and a road project because they're separately defined terms. They're separate uses in the county's regulatory scheme. So it can't be both. That ends the inquiry. But I want to address ODOT's new position, which seems to be it's a road project and it's a class 3. Well, a road project, and I wrote this down, it's in our stuff, the definition of a road project. It's a road and street project means construction and maintenance of the roadway, bike lanes, sidewalks, and other facilities related to the road. So the only project that you can include in a road project would be a bike lane. That's part of the highway. That's not a separately defined use. And, in a multi-use path, where's the clock?
Keep going.
Okay.
You can continue. I'd like to get your thoughts on this since you've started it. So go ahead.
So a multi-use path by definition, and we've defined it in our written material, it has to be separated from the highway by open space. So it can't be a bike lane, because a bike lane is part of a road project. And we've kind of described this in our written material pretty extensively too, is that if something is a road project, if you're going to say one component is a road project, it has to relate to the road. It can't be a separately defined use, which is what we're dealing with here. So to try to stretch that, it seems like ODOT is saying that this multi-use path can be another facility related to the road, but to make that happen, they also go into all these other definitions. They say, well, they don't call it a multi-use path in that part of their analysis. They say, well, it could be a bikeway, it could be a bike facility, it could be a bike route. Well, none of those are used in the definition of a road or street project. And to get where they want to go, you'd have to insert language in this definition to say that a road and street project is construction and maintenance of a roadway, bike lanes, sidewalks, and other bike facilities. And it doesn't say that. It says other facilities related to the road or street. And you got to consider the context. Here, when the drafters wanted to include bike facilities as part of a road project, they put it in there, and they only put in bike lane. If they wanted to include other bike related uses as part of a road project, like a bike way or a bike path or anything like that, they would have put in maintenance of the roadway, bike lanes, bike facilities, bikeways, sidewalks, and other facilities. They didn't do that. So we think the fundamental problem is, because it's a separately defined use, it could never be a road project. But even if you went down that rabbit hole of could it be a road project, it doesn't fit the definition of a road project. Staff interjected that Title 17 might come into play, and we dispute that. I'm not going to get into it now because I don't have a lot of time, and I've written about it. But Title 17 is the subdivision ordinance. And in that, there's another definition of a bikeway. And it seems that staff staff is saying maybe it could be a bikeway. But if you read the definition of a bikeway in Title 17, it not only, it says, here's what a bikeway is, and then it lists 5 examples of a bikeway. All of those are exclusively bike related. None of them are multimodal facilities like this multi-use path. So even if you get to Title 17 and start going into those definitions, we believe the code is inconsistent with ODOT's position. This cannot be a facility that is part of a road project. And so for that reason, we would think the inquiry ends right there. It cannot be considered a road project at all, and therefore it wouldn't be allowed. Now, briefly, I want to talk about if you were to go down this path that ODOT wants you to go down and say, well, maybe it could be a multi-use path, which is a separate use, and it could also be a road project, which I don't think you can do under the language of the code.
Let me ask you about that. I think that's an important distinction. You are saying that the multi-use path cannot be a subset of a road project?
Correct.
And can you just walk me through that logic and why one couldn't be more inclusive and the other be just a specific example of it?
Well, 2 things. One, because when you go down, when you read the code as it's written, and it goes through, it's got the definitions, and then in the use categories, in the specific zoning sections like 1860, 020, and 030 list the uses in the RR10 zone. The terms that are defined in the code as uses are then listed in those zones. And so for example, in the Lapine zone, it lists multi-use path as one of those uses permitted. And in the RR10 zone, it doesn't list that. It lists as a separate use, a road project, road or street project. My point is, if it's specifically listed somewhere else, it can't be the road project. they're mutually exclusive because they're separate uses listed elsewhere throughout the code. It would be like, it would allow people to say, to take terms anywhere in the code and say, well, that's a subset of this permitted use, and therefore I get to do it. Even though it's not listed in my zone, it can fit under this other use. That's why we have specific uses in the code listed. You either qualify for that use or you don't qualify for that use. To go down the path and say a multi-use path, which is a separately defined term, is also a road project, creates incredible confusion in the code and allows people to get away with describing all kinds of uses as subsets of other uses. And that's not what the code is allowed to do. It doesn't allow us to do that. It does have a similar use provision, but they're not using that. And they couldn't in this case for the reason I just said, is you can't get a similar use if, generally speaking, if the use is listed elsewhere in another zone. The rule of construction is if it's listed there and not here, it's intentional. So I don't think you can say that a separately defined use could also be part of another use. I don't think that's contextually or textually allowed under the code. So I do want to just briefly address, if it were a road project though, this whole thing about it being a class 3 project and not changing traffic patterns, I made a note on that. The evidence, the ODOT said, well, this is just existing use, we're just making it better. The evidence of the use of Highway 97 for biking now was data of 3 Strava posts. You know how Strava is, you post your results to all your friends to brag. And there were 3 rides total. And no pedestrian use documented whatsoever on Highway 97. And if you read the flap, they predict that in 1 year, if this is constructed, there's going to be 80,000 new users. I would submit that is a very dramatic change, going from 3 bike riders now to 80,000 different users of all modes of transportation. We would think that at a minimum, this is a would be a class 3 project. And then finally, if you'll indulge me for another minute or two, is I did raise a procedural question, and that is, the declaratory judgment ruling provision specifically does not allow you to use it to challenge a prior decision. And we're going back to this zoning thing primarily, which is the zoning has been established by a decision. They're clearly asking you to revisit that decision. That's the word they use. ODOT says we're going to revisit the zoning. The declaratory ruling provision in 22.40A specifically limits it to interpreting language and comprehensive plans. In fact, 22.40.050, I pointed out, specifically says it cannot be used to amend language. Well, the question I have is, what language are they asking you to interpret when they say change the zoning? They're clearly asking you to revisit a decision using the guise of a declaratory ruling and look at a prior final land use decision. So we would submit that this is on that issue, this is a process that is not really permitted under the county code, and I don't think they qualify for a couple of the other ones as well.
Let me ask you a follow-up question about that one, Mr. Kobeck. I understand your position about not doing a collateral attack and that the prior decision was a final decision. I guess what I'm trying to do is put this in the context, though, of zone changes. Would the Board of Commission's decision be sufficient to actually change the zone if it went from basically the rural residential to the F2? I mean, I don't know if I'm describing that distinction well enough. It's one thing to have a decision about a permit. It's another to use a Board of County Commissioners decision to actually affect a zone change. And I'm trying to understand if your position is that the county board effectively changed the zone with that decision and that cannot be challenged.
No, if you read that decision, I don't think the county board changed the zone at all. I think the county board is charged with interpreting its maps and its ordinances, et cetera. And so the issue in that was, what is the zoning of this property? what is the official zoning? There wasn't, as I read that decision, there wasn't ever a question, it's whether it's RR10 and we want to change it. What the county board said is, we're looking at our map and we're interpreting what that zone is. And our provision says that when there's any question about it, we go to the middle of the road. And so they looked at it and they go, in this case, we're determining that the line is in the middle of the highway and therefore all of the property to the east in this area is F2 property. So all they did was interpret their map and they made a final decision that it was F2, always F2. I don't know anything about a 1979 RR10 zone. That's my client. They own the property and they're unaware that any property over there that was ever zoned RR10 and then rezoned to F2. That was news to them when they heard it this morning or this evening. So I don't think the county board did any zone change in 1998. And I would add to that, you know, that's part of the distinction in that Medford case. You know, the Medford case, the people did it right. When the city council made a decision on what the zone was, they appealed it. They challenged it properly. And it got up and it went through the right channels and a decision was made. ODOT accepted that ruling in 1998 and they never appealed it. And that's what gives them the problem here, because now that's the collateral attack doctrine. You can't challenge an unappealed decision. So I think in Medford, that's the big distinction. Their parties did it right. Here, ODOT didn't do it right. Now they want to come back and put you in the position of having to say to the governing body, your decision's wrong. And I'm not only do I think it's wrong, I'm going to reverse you. And I know that's not a really comfortable position sometimes for a hearings officer, but and I don't think you need to be in it. I think the law is pretty clear. You can't revisit that decision. They need to, and that gets to what the ODOT can do under the declaratory judgment. They can't use it to amend the zoning. The county board has established what it is. They need to go to the county board and ask to change it.
Thanks, Mr. Kobach. It sounds like you had other additional materials in writing. I assume those are different than what was submitted to the record earlier. Those are just submitted today.
We just finished it. There's a lot, as you can appreciate, there are a lot of material in this with
I just want to keep track and make sure I'm not assuming that it's
just we submitted some detailed stuff today that is different than what we submitted in May. Mr. Winlink submitted some additional stuff today as well. So you should have both. Okay,
I'll make sure to review it all. Thank you.
And then Mr. Winlinks, can he still have his 1 minute, even though I kind of went a little long?
He can have his 1 minute, but he should give you a hard time about it.
Yeah, he probably will.
Mr. Brooks, thank you for your graciousness affording us extra time here. I'll make this very short. Chris has hit on the high points. The only thing I will say is specifically is defined in Title 18 under the definitions, multi-use paths are a specifically designed use. It's not lumped into some sort of a highway project or bicycle path or anything of that. One thing I want to get to, I will make a comment. There is no parking facilities provided at the High Desert Museum at this time. I provided my written testimony, the contract between ODOT, which is the MOU that they keep touting. In that MOU, there's no parking provided at this time. That will require additional review. The other thing they say is there's 4 private properties on the west side, which is why they're choosing to go to the east side. They do not give any credence to the 6 private properties and 2 residents and the commercial tree farm, which is a resource zone on the east side, in any of their testimony. And that's something they need to consider. Although I agree, this is not part of this process. The Mylars, which I was a big part of that 1998 conditional use application by ODOT for the way station and the right of way, which is right in front of my place there. I posed it. If you go back to the record, I submitted a lot of testimony to that record. One of the issues that came up is that Mylar that ODOT's trying to hang their hat on is so crude. And if you look at it, part of it actually extends over portions of 97 into the RR10 zone and other portions don't. And then we attributed that just because of the nature of the tape. You can't really take straight tape and bend it to that contour of the highway. So that's why the question came to pass there, and it went before the board, and they agreed because there was confusion there. The intent was the center of the highway was the dividing point between the RR10 and the F2. Our side of the road's always been F2. It's never changed. And everybody accepted the fact that the dividing point was the center of the highway. And if anybody looking at that drawing as ODOT presented earlier, you can tell that you can't scale anything off of that drawing. I'm really surprised that the GIS guy from the county can say that he can officially scale something from that. That's just an interpretive look at that thing, and you can tell whoever did that, the highway would have to be the conclusion of where that dividing point is. And I thank you very much for your time on this and the extra time you provided us.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Winlings.
Do
We'll
you have
move
any
on.
questions?
Oh, I don't have any questions for you. Thank you.
All right. Have a Merry Christmas.
Thanks. We'll move on to anyone else who has signed up in opposition of the application.
And if you're attending remotely, can you use the raise hand feature now to let me know if you'd like to testify? All right, so there's no one else in person or remotely that's notified that they'd like to testify.
Okay, and then just to confirm, is anyone signed up to testify in a neutral position?
No one in the room and no raised hands online.
Okay, thank you. We will then have the applicant come back up for a rebuttal if it would like to.
Sorry. Mr. Brooks, there was a lot there, so Ken and I will attempt to respond, and we may bounce back and forth a bit. I guess I'll begin by addressing the focus on multi-use path as it was used in a grant application from, I believe, 6 years ago. I want to point out that ODOT's use of the term multi-use path is quite distinct and different from how the county uses it. Multi-use path in the transportation industry has a distinct technical term that does not distinguish between recreation and transportation utility. They are one and the same. So when we use the term multi-use path, we're not talking about a bark mulch, circular loop around a rest stop. We're talking about a transportation facility that can be used by people walking or biking. County code does distinguish between multi-use path, recreation trail, and bike path. Part of the reason that we're here today is to uncover and reveal precisely what those distinctions are. It's our opinion that there are three different terms being used there. Recreation trail being like what I described. It would be like a bark mulch circular path at a rest stop. A multi-use path, as the county uses it, we believe would be something larger in scale, but still entirely recreation in nature. Whereas bike path would be a transportation facility. And I want to just point out a few corrections on the testimony that you heard from the attorney, where he stated that bikeways, excuse me, that bikeways are not road and street projects. In fact, the definition of road and street project includes bicycle route, which is defined as a right-of-way for bicycle traffic. Additionally, Section 17 of Deschutes County Code details that, oh, sorry. The assertion was also made that bikeways are exclusively for bikes, which is also incorrect. Section 17 of Deschutes County Code states that that a bikeway is any road, path, or way which in some manner is specifically designated as being open to bicycle traffic, regardless of whether such facilities are designated for the exclusive use of bicycles or are shared with other transportation modes. It then lists 5 types of bikeways, including bike path, which is defined as a bikeway physically separated from motorized vehicle traffic by an open space barrier, and either within the highway right-of-way, highway or road right-of-way, or within an independent right-of-way. So clearly, as the county uses the term bikeway, it is intended to include not just exclusive use of bikes. I mean, that's in the definition. Additionally, section 17 or Deschutes County Code 18-04030 specifically defines road and street projects to include bicycle lanes, which would be another type of bike facility that would be a road or street project. I want to also correct the assertion that only 3 rides were recorded on Strava. As the record shows, I don't know offhand, but I want to say it's in the thousands were recorded. I believe that's more than 3. I'm going to let Ken speak for a moment.
And again, that's just one piece of evidence for bicycle travel. We have our testimony for the Lava Butte path, where we heard from a number of respondents who would either like to use the facility or currently use the facility. It's also worthy to point out that Strava is used by a narrow subset of the population. So presumably not everyone riding a bicycle is using Strava. A larger number of people could be presumed to be on the facility, using it on a bicycle or walking.
Thanks, Ken. Officer Brooks, I want to address the procedural issue that was raised regarding the declaratory judgment being used for overturning or establishing a zone change. To be clear, we would find it acceptable if this hearings officer referred that question to the Board of County Commissioners. However, we don't believe we're asking the hearings officer to make a zone change or to overturn a case. We're simply referring to Deschutes County Code section 18-12040 that states, in case of any dispute regarding the zoning classification of property subject to the zoning code, the original ordinance with map exhibit contained in the official county records will control. That is what we have done. We've gone to the original map exhibit. The original map exhibit clearly shows a gap between the forest lands to the east of our right-of-way and the rural residential lands that our property is zoned. That zoning and the boundary that are shown in the original map exhibit from 1990 or from 1979, they're also shown in the digital replica, much more clearly in the digital replica. And we recognize that it is just a replica, but it is an expert interpretation of those original Mylars. And we also have the expert opinion of the zoning, land use, and permits GIS staff at Deschutes County stating that that digital replica is the correct interpretation of the original Mylars. So we're not asking for a decision to be overturned. We're not asking for a zone change to be made. We're simply applying Deschutes County Code 18-12040. And just really quickly, and I think Ken has more he wants to say. There have been multiple mentions in the record, in this case and in others, that we are directly impacting 6 private properties on the east side of Highway 97. And Officer Brooks, that's simply not the case. The path does not touch, go through, pass through. I don't know any other way to say it. It doesn't touch those properties. It runs through it runs through rural residential lands that are adjacent to forest zone lands. One other point that I wanted to respond to, there was, I guess, unwillingness to believe that the museum is providing parking in support of providing access to this path. We've put in the record that they are. We provided the MOU stating that they are. We provided the letter of support from the museum indicating that what we are saying is consistent with what they understand. They've attended tonight and stated as such. I'm not sure how else to prove that there will be a place to park a vehicle and use the path there until we break ground.
Thank you, Officer Brooks. David covered most of it. The last clarification on my list that we wanted to make where there was a statement saying that 50% of the path is on F2 zone. Again, we are referencing the original Mylars that would map control, where the 6-mile path would be on rural residential 10 north of the federal property, and only 2,400 feet would be adjacent to F2. Whereas that adjacent portion of the path is nowhere near 50% of the entire project.
I think the only other thing that we wanted to add, and I'm not sure if rebuttal is appropriate or if we do this later, but given that Mr. Kovacs has entered new information to the record, we would like to request that 7-day period to respond to the new information.
Okay. Okay. Anything else?
No, I think that covers it. Thank you, Officer Brooks.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to just ask staff if there's anything that staff needs to bring to my attention, not about the procedural schedule, but just any other final comments.
Yeah, I did want to provide a quick overview of some of the zoning maps in the record, just to kind of orient you and anyone else attending tonight, kind of what is in the record for the zoning maps. So I added to the record a memo. It's dated May. Sorry.
Probably May 18th.
Correct. Yeah, May 18th. And this was to supplement my incomplete letter that was mailed out, but I do want to show just kind of how the maps are added in here. So starting, my computer's a little slow because these are large files. But starting on page 2, this is the first zoning map adopted by the county. At this time, the current zones were not the designation that applied. And then as you move through, you'll see amendments or new maps that were subsequently adopted. I recommend looking at this bottom left-hand corner for the date of when that map was adopted by the Board of County Commissioners. And I'm just going to skip through these, but you can see these dates are changing, moving into the 80s now. Zooming back out, the next couple maps you'll see in the same lower left-hand corner. These maps were developed by W&H Pacific. They were responsible for digitizing the county's Mylars into a digital database to be used for our GIS system. So these maps are associated with that process. And then moving on, so these just continue to be iterations of that. And then I do want to note, in 1992, there was a different ordinance where the county's comprehensive plan was updated again, and that speaks to repealing. If you read the ordinance that's also in this memo, speaks to the effect of that, and I recommend reviewing that in the context of which Mylar map may control. So I'm going to stop sharing that, but I just want to provide that background. And then I did also want to note, to the extent that there is general or public access parking on the High Desert Museum's property, the county site plan criteria specifically stipulate that site plan approval is required, regardless if the use is permitted outright or conditionally. So just highlighting that. That's all I had.
All right, thank you for those clarifications, and I appreciate you walking me through the maps. It's helpful to see how that's structured. All right. I think we can, well, let me just ask the applicant. I always like to give the applicant the last word but specifically if there's anything that Ms. House just said that you feel like you need to rebut, you have the opportunity, but
No, we don't have anything to rebut, Officer Brooks, other than to thank staff and the hearings officer for their time this evening and over the past many months.
yeah. So with that, we'll wrap up the testimony. I did hear the applicant request that we keep the written record open for 7 days. In this context, we would typically do our sort of 777 approach, where the record would be left open for 7 days. There would be a rebuttal period for participants to rebut anything that's submitted during that first 7-day period, and then a final 7-day period for the applicant to provide a legal argument with no new evidence. I'm looking at the calendar, and that starts to take us square into the holidays. So I guess if we did the 777, we'd be talking about December 13th, 20th, and 27th being the due dates. And I'm open to making it different if that's helpful to the parties, but I guess I'd like to hear from the applicant first if that 777 period works initially.
I think that it works for us.
Okay. All right. I guess there's really, I hate to be so informal, but there's so few participants. And I guess I just want to make sure if there's any other participants in the room that think that 777 is not workable. I'd like to know if it feels workable, because we get the first 2 weeks done before the major holidays, and then the applicant's willing to do that third week right there at the end of the month. So if there's any objection, let me know. Okay.
No
All
objection.
right. Thank you. Ms. House, I'll ask you to provide some additional instructions to participants in light of the extension of the 777 period.
So just to restate what the hearings officer just established, so new evidence and testimony can be submitted by any participant up to Wednesday, December 13th at 4 p.m. Then any participant can submit rebuttal evidence up until December 20th at 4 p.m. And then lastly, the applicant only can submit final argument, and their deadline for that submittal is December 27th by 4 p.m. It's important to note materials must be received by the county servers by 4 p.m. So anything that comes in after that, if it hasn't hit our server, we can't accept it. The alternative is drop off paper. And a few more things to note. Any submittals should be directed to me, not the hearings officer. I will ensure everything gets uploaded into the record. That's the website that's been referenced several times tonight. Emails should be sent to me, again, caroline.house@deschutes.org. And the other key thing is we don't retrieve any information from cloud storage locations, or like hyperlinked information. You need to actually put that submittal into the record. And yeah, just restating, electronic submittals must be received by 4 p.m. That covers everything that I needed to share.
Okay, thank you. Then we will close tonight's hearing. The record will be open for written submittals only, as just outlined by Ms. House on those dates. And we will go off the record here at 7:29. Thank you, everyone.